Tonight we step into a story that unfolds not on the violent seas where Viking longships carved their paths through storm-tossed waters, or on the blood-soaked battlefields where warriors met their fates with swords raised high and shields locked in formation, but rather within the quiet walls of their homes, where an entirely different kind of battle was waged every single day throughout the long, dark winter months that stretched endlessly across the northern lands, like a frozen blanket smothering all life beneath its weight. What if someone were to tell you with absolute certainty that the Vikings' greatest and most dangerous enemy was not the neighboring tribes who threatened their borders with raids and warfare that could erupt without warning, or the stormy seas that claimed ships and brave sailors with terrifying regularity when the winds turned vicious, but rather an invisible killer that crept silently and relentlessly into every single home, regardless of the wealth or status of its inhabitants? The northern winter, in those ancient times, was utterly unforgiving in ways that are difficult for modern people living in heated homes with thermostats and insulation to truly comprehend. And a single bitterly cold night, when temperatures plummeted to depths that froze the very breath in your lungs, could wipe out an entire settlement of families huddled together for warmth, if it were not for their unique and carefully developed survival techniques that had been refined over countless generations of trial and error and tragic loss. These hardy people who sailed across unknown seas and explored distant lands with courage that seems almost reckless to us today had no central heating systems with thermostats that could be adjusted at will with the simple turn of a dial, no modern insulation materials engineered in laboratories to trap warmth with scientific precision, using polymers and air pockets, and certainly no electricity to power devices that could warm their homes at the flip of a switch or the press of a button. But through centuries of observation and experimentation and the hard-won lessons passed down from parent to child in an oral tradition that preserved vital knowledge, they somehow managed to create a carefully controlled microclimate inside their wooden halls that today, when examined by modern engineers and architects studying sustainable design, would be rightfully called an engineering marvel that rivals many contemporary innovations in green building. These determined people living on the edge of the habitable world turned the simple act of house building into a sophisticated art form, dedicated entirely to fighting the relentless assault of nature, where every single stone placed in a wall and every blade of grass laid upon a roof mattered profoundly to the survival of everyone who lived within those thick, protective walls. Their homes were not just simple shelters thrown together hastily to provide basic protection from wind and rain and the occasional snowstorm, but rather they were complex heat-reserving machines that worked according to fundamental laws of physics that we are only now rediscovering and beginning to appreciate fully in our modern age of environmental consciousness. The storm outside sounds fierce and terrible tonight as the wind howls like a living creature seeking entry through every crack and gap, but here inside, by the glowing fire, crackling with life, we are glad and grateful to be protected from its fury and its cold embrace. If you follow this story carefully all the way to the end without letting your attention wander to other concerns, you will learn in detail how an architectural secret known to the Vikings as the thermal dome, a brilliant concept that seems almost magical in its effectiveness when you first heard about it, allowed these northern people to walk around comfortably inside their homes wearing only light clothing made of linen, while outside beyond the thick walls, the temperatures were freezing to depths that would kill an unprotected person within hours of exposure. The roof of a Viking house was never just simple protection from the falling rain or snow that nature threw at the structure with seasonal regularity, but rather it was a complex biological organism that lived and breathed and changed with the seasons according to its own mysterious life cycles that intertwined with the rhythms of nature. The Scandinavians who built these remarkable structures that still inspire awe today covered their longhouses that stretched sometimes 30 meters from end to end with a thick and heavy layer of turf that had been cut carefully from the dense northern soil, along with all the tangled roots of the grasses that grew there, forming a living mat. This living green carpet of earth and vegetation weighed literally tons when fully laid across the wooden frame, requiring extremely powerful supporting structures made of oak logs or pine timbers that had been carefully selected for their strength and straightness and ability to bear enormous loads without bending. However, this tremendous weight that pressed down constantly with the force of gravity ensured that the roof fit absolutely perfectly to the walls below, leaving no gaps or openings for the icy wind that screamed across the landscape with relentless force to penetrate into the living space below, where families gathered. The turf was laid down carefully in several distinct layers, with each layer serving a specific purpose in the overall thermal system, and the bottom layer, placed directly against the wooden roof frame, was positioned grass side down so that the living roots would naturally intertwine and mesh with the wooden structure beneath, creating a biological bond. Over time, as the seasons passed and the grass continued its life cycle through spring and summer, the vegetation sprouted through the layers above, turning the entire roof gradually into a monolithic layer of earth that was reinforced throughout, with living roots that acted like natural rebar, holding everything together in a coherent mass. This substantial layer of earth covering the wooden structure acted as an incredibly effective thermal regulator that worked day and night without any human intervention, smoothing out the sharp and potentially dangerous temperature changes that occurred between day and night, or when weather systems moved rapidly across the region, bringing sudden shifts. In summer, when the sun climbed high in the northern sky and stayed there for long hours, barely dipping below the horizon, such a roof actively evaporated moisture that accumulated from rain and dew, creating a cooling effect through the physics of phase change that prevented the house from turning into an unbearable oven under the long polar sun that never seemed to set during those bright months when daylight was constant. In winter, when darkness dominated and temperatures plummeted to dangerous levels that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, the earth layer covered with an insulating blanket of snow became an insurmountable barrier to the killing cold that prowled outside like a predator, preserving and holding the precious heat generated inside by the central fire in the bodies of the people and animals living within. In winter, specifically when the true test of survival came with its harsh conditions, a thick layer of fresh snow settled naturally on the turf roof like a gift from the sky, and the owners, who understood the principles involved from generations of experience, deliberately did not clear this snow away until it reached a certain critical limit that might threaten the structural integrity of the wooden beams below. Snow, with its porous structure filled with countless tiny air pockets separated by delicate ice crystals, is actually one of the best natural insulators known to human beings throughout history, far superior to many materials we manufacture today in factories using complex chemical processes. Under this protective snowcap that could be a meter thick or more in the deepest winter, when storms piled drift upon drift, the temperature of the turf layer itself never dropped critical sub-zero levels that would allow frost to penetrate through to the living space below. The result of all these layers working together in harmony was essentially a complex layered cake made of wood and birch bark and earth and living roots and finally snow on top, which retained the heat generated by the fire and human bodies better than solid masonry walls constructed of stone or brick that were commonly used in other parts of Europe. Even in the most severe frosts, when the outside temperature dropped to -30 degrees or lower, and the wind chill made it feel even colder, the temperature directly under the roof inside the hall remained safely above zero, where water would not freeze. Birch bark, harvested from the pale trees that grew throughout the northern forests in abundance, played the absolutely critical role of a modern waterproofing membrane in this carefully engineered construction that had been perfected over generations. It was laid directly on the wooden roof frame in huge overlapping sheets that had been carefully peeled from the trees in long strips arranged so that water from rain or melting snow would run off smoothly without ever touching the wood beneath that need to stay dry to prevent rot. Birch bark, with its natural oils and resins, does not rot or decay for decades due to its high tar content, which includes natural preservatives that resist bacterial and fungal growth, and this remarkable quality made the roof virtually eternal with proper maintenance and occasional replacement of damaged sections that had been torn by wind or pecked by birds. Without this crucial waterproof layer protecting the timbers from moisture seeping down from above, the damp earth sitting directly on top would quickly turn the supporting beams into crumbling dust through rot caused by fungi and bacteria, eventually collapsing the entire roof structure on the heads of the family sleeping peacefully inside, unaware of the danger developing above them. It was truly a brilliant example of using the natural properties of materials that were readily available in any northern forest, rather than requiring exotic imports from distant lands that would be expensive and difficult to obtain. The angle of the roof was calculated with mathematical precision by the master builders, even though they possessed no written formulas or geometric instruments, and this angle had to hold the insulating snow in place, but not allow it to accumulate to the point where it would break through the roof structure with its tremendous weight that increased with every storm. A roof that was too steep would throw off the snow in sheets during temperature changes when the surface began to melt, depriving the house of that additional critical insulation when it was needed most during the coldest parts of winter. A roof that was too flat might not withstand the enormous load during heavy snowfalls that could dump meters of snow in a single night, or during the spring thaw when the snow became waterlogged and even heavier with absorbed moisture. The craftsmen who built these houses and had learned their trade through years of apprenticeship working alongside masters passed on their accumulated knowledge of the ideal angles and proportions from generation to generation in an oral tradition that was carefully guarded and treasured. A mistake in the calculations based on faulty judgment or poor understanding would cost the entire family their lives in the first snowy winter when the roof collapsed under excessive weight or heat escaped through improper design. The grass growing on the roof was not simply decorative or accidental, but required regular maintenance throughout the year to keep it healthy and functional. And in the summer months when it grew thick and lush from rainfall and sunlight, goats were often let loose on the roof to trim what essentially became a lawn suspended in the air above the living space. The roots of the living plants worked constantly throughout the growing season to suck excess moisture out of the soil layer through capillary action, preventing the roof from becoming waterlogged and too heavy to support safely on the wooden frame below. In dry years when rain was scarce and droughts threatened, the turf covering even had to be watered by carrying buckets up ladders to prevent the grass from drying out completely and dying and the soil from cracking into pieces that would separate. Cracks in the turf layer, no matter how small, could become dangerous bridges of cold through which precious heat would escape from the interior in a steady flow that would chill the inhabitants, and repairing these cracks was a constant concern during maintenance season. It was truly a symbiotic relationship between the human dwelling and the living natural world surrounding it, a partnership that benefited both parties. Inside the house, beneath such a carefully constructed roof that had taken weeks or months to build properly, the sound of the howling wind that raged outside with tremendous force became only a quiet and distant hum that barely disturbed the peace of the interior space. The layers of earth and snow absorbed any noise from outside, including the screaming of storms, creating an atmosphere of absolute peace and security inside the room that was so important for mental health and well-being. This was critically important for the psychological comfort and emotional well-being of people who were locked in a confined space together for many long, dark months without escape or relief from each other's constant presence. The silence in the house allowed families to rest properly and recover their strength after hard work performed in the bitter cold outside during the short daylight hours of winter, when tasks still needed to be completed. Sound insulation was really a secondary benefit but extremely pleasant effect of this construction technology that had primarily been developed for thermal reasons. Interestingly enough, such traditional turf roofs can still be found functioning perfectly in remote areas of Iceland and Norway today, even after more than 1,000 years of continuous use by families living in these structures. Modern architects concerned about environmental impact and energy consumption are now returning to the ancient idea of green roofs for the sake of ecology and energy efficiency that reduces fossil fuel consumption and carbon emissions into the atmosphere. The Vikings who built these structures did not know the modern words ecology or carbon footprint that we use constantly today in discussions about sustainability, but their practical solutions, born of necessity and refined through experience, were incredibly rational and effective at achieving the same goals we pursue now. They simply used whatever materials were under their feet and readily available in the immediate environment to create masterpieces of architecture that worked in harmony with nature rather than fighting against it. We, in our modern world, with all our technology and scientific knowledge, are only now rediscovering and beginning to appreciate what was simply the norm for northern builders of that distant past, who had no choice but to work with what nature provided. To build one typical longhouse that could shelter an extended family of perhaps 20 or 30 people, including children and elderly, it was necessary to cut turf carefully from an area equal to 2 modern football fields, laid side by side, which gives you some sense of the scale involved. It was a colossal task that involved the entire settlement working together in cooperation, or at minimum, a large extended family laboring for weeks during the short summer season when the ground was soft enough to work. Each layer of soil had to be cut with special shovels that had a specific geometry designed for the task of slicing through the dense root mat, and the technique had to be learned through practice and instruction from experienced workers. This process of gathering materials and building united the community because everyone understood that the survival of one house and its inhabitants depended entirely on the help of neighbors who would expect the same assistance in return when their time came to build. A single person working alone without help would not have been able to build such a substantial dwelling in the short northern summer when construction was possible, and the cooperative nature of the work strengthened social bonds that were essential for survival in harsh conditions. What if someone were to suggest to you that the distinctive shape of Viking houses with their curved walls was actually borrowed directly from the design of ships, but turned upside down and planted on the land like an inverted hull? If you were to look at a longhouse from directly above as a bird might see it soaring on the wind, you would notice immediately that its walls were not straight and parallel as you might expect from most modern building. Instead, they curved slightly outward in a gentle arc along their length, resembling quite closely the sides of a dreer or trading vessel that had been flipped and set down on the earth. This convex shape that might seem merely decorative or whimsical made the house incredibly resistant to the lateral wind loads that were constant in the exposed northern lands where storms could reach tremendous velocities. The wind that could reach tremendous speeds during winter storms did not hit a flat wall directly trying to knock the entire structure over with brute force like a battering ram, but instead it flowed smoothly around the curved sides from both directions like water flowing around a stone in a stream. Such aerodynamics that the builders understood instinctively without formal education in physics or engineering allowed houses to stand firmly for centuries on the windswept coasts, where storms were frequent and violent and could destroy poorly designed structures. Right angles, which are so common in modern construction and seem natural to us, were extremely rare in traditional Viking architecture. And the reason for this was practical rather than aesthetic, because sharp angles were vulnerable to freezing and heat loss that could endanger the inhabitant. An angle is a place where cold air naturally accumulates in pools like water finding the lowest point, and where it is most difficult to provide quality insulation that prevents heat from escaping into the environment. The oval or boat-shaped form of the house minimized the number of these dead zones, where air could stagnate and cool down dangerously while people slept. Warm air inside such a carefully shaped room circulated more evenly throughout the space without getting trapped, flowing smoothly around the curved walls, like currents in the ocean, rather than getting stuck in corners where it would cool and create cold spots. This was an intuitive understanding of thermodynamics and fluid dynamics based purely on centuries of observation and practical experience, passed down through generations, not on mathematical equations or computer simulations. The doors in Viking houses were deliberately made low and narrow, like the entrance to a cave, forcing anyone entering to bow their head and bend their body in a gesture of humility. This architectural feature not only had a defensive purpose by making it difficult for an armed enemy to suddenly burst in through the entrance with weapons raised ready to fight. The main purpose of such a small opening positioned close to the ground was actually to conserve precious heat each time the door was opened to admit someone from the freezing outside world. A tall door that allowed people to walk through upright standing at their full height would release a huge cloud of warm air that had naturally accumulated under the high ceiling through convection, and this lost heat would be difficult and time-consuming to replace by burning more precious fuel. A low opening positioned closer to the ground allowed the cold outside air that was denser than warm air to enter only at the bottom level near the floor, without affecting the main thermal layer suspended above that, kept everyone warm. The entrance to the house was often protected by a small vestibule or an extension that served as an airlock between the inside and outside environments, creating a buffer zone. A person would first enter the cold porch area, close the outer door firmly behind them to seal off the outside, and only then, after a moment of adjustment, open the inner door to the living quarters where the fire burned. This two-door system prevented a direct draft that could instantly cool down the carefully heated dwelling in seconds when wind rushed through, and it also gave people time to shake off snow and remove wet outer garments before entering. Firewood and tools were also stored conveniently in these porch areas to keep them dry and ready for use when needed, and this storage added another layer of insulation between the living space and the harsh outside world. The buffer zone, created by the porch, was truly the first line of defense against the harsh external environment that wanted to steal every bit of warmth from the house. Windows in longhouses were either absent altogether, which seems strange to us today, or consisted of tiny openings covered with scraped ox bladders that had been stretched thin and translucent to allow some light through. Glass was not available in the north at that time because the technology for making it had not spread to these remote regions, and an open window would have been an unaffordable luxury that no family could justify given the heat loss it would cause. The ox bladder covering let in a dim and murky light that was better than nothing, just enough to avoid bumping into objects during the short daylight hours when the sun was visible above the horizon. Most activities actually took place by the flickering light of the hearth fire, which created a special atmosphere of semi-darkness and shadow that seems strange and primitive to us today, but was perfectly normal to them. The absence of windows made the walls a monolithic barrier against the cold that had no weak points where heat could escape or cold could enter, and this was essential for maintaining a survivable temperature inside. The walls themselves were built of vertically placed logs that had been carefully selected and fitted tightly together with remarkable precision given the simple tools available. Often a double wall construction was used with a gap between the inner and outer walls that was filled completely with earth or moss for additional insulation that could be as effective as modern materials. The thickness of such a wall could reach a meter or more in the wealthiest homes, where no expense was spared, turning the house into a real fortress against winter that could withstand any storm. Wood itself is an excellent natural heat insulator with air pockets in its cellular structure, and in combination with an earthen layer packed tightly into the gap, it became virtually impenetrable to cold that tried to work its way through. Outside, the logs were coated with clay or resin to protect them from wind and moisture that would cause rot over time and weaken the structure until it failed. The floors in the houses were most often earthen rather than wooden, packed tightly by the feet of many generations walking across them day after day over decades or even centuries in the same building. The earthen floor had enormous thermal inertia due to its mass heating up slowly during the day when the fire burned and people moved about, and cooling down just as slowly at night when activity ceased. Sometimes the floor was covered with a layer of straw or reeds for additional insulation from the cold ground below that could suck heat away through conduction, and this covering was replaced regularly as it became soiled or compacted. Wealthy homes might have wooden floors raised slightly above the ground on joists, creating an air cushion that provided insulation and kept feet warmer than direct contact with earth. But even simple packed earth, if it was kept dry through proper drainage, served as a good foundation that did not steal heat the way stone or tile would. The orientation of the house to the cardinal points was also not accidental, but carefully planned based on understanding of sun angles and prevailing winds. The ends of the building usually faced east and west to maximize exposure to the low winter sun, and the long walls faced north and south to minimize the impact of the coldest winds. The entrance was usually located on the leeward side, where the building itself provided shelter, taking into account the prevailing winter winds that were known in the area from long observation. This reduced the likelihood of the door being blocked by snowdrifts overnight, or of cold wind blasting directly into the house every time someone entered or left. The Vikings who settled in new areas knew how to read the landscape carefully, like sailors reading the sea, and fit their dwellings into it as organically as possible rather than imposing a foreign design. Inside the house, the space was unified without solid partitions or separate rooms that would block heat flow and create cold zones. This allowed the heat from the central hearth to spread unhindered to all corners of the dwelling without obstruction. Any partitions that were needed for privacy or to define different functional areas were made low, like waist-high walls, or hung with animal skins so as not to interfere with air convection that distributed warmth throughout the space. Living in such an open space without privacy required special social norms that everyone understood and followed, but it was absolutely necessary for survival through the winter when heat conservation was paramount. Privacy was a sacrifice willingly made on the altar of warmth and life, when the alternative was freezing to death alone in a private room. Inside the longhouse, there was no chimney as we know it today, with a vertical pipe and strong draft pulling smoke upward and out of the building. Smoke from the open hearth simply rose naturally through convection and accumulated under the high roof, forming a dense, thick cloud that hung in the air like a living thing. This black blanket of smoke hung over the heads of the inhabitants below, slowly seeping through special openings in the roof that could be adjusted to control the flow. But this was not a mistake on the part of the builders, who did not know any better or lacked the skill to build a proper chimney, but actually a well-thought-out engineering solution that saved lives through physics. The layer of smoke trapped under the ceiling acted as a powerful heat insulator, like a blanket trapping warm air in the lower part of the room where people lived and worked. The smoke created what was known as a heat dome, reflecting infrared radiation from the fire back down toward the people below rather than allowing it to escape directly through the roof. If the smoke had escaped too quickly through large openings without this trapped layer, the precious heat would have gone with it, streaming upward, leaving the house unbearably cold even with a roaring fire burning. The Vikings essentially lived in a layer of relatively clean air near the floor level at breathing height, while a hot, poisonous atmosphere raged above their heads in the space they could not use anyway. Standing up straight on the bench would have meant getting your head into the suffocating zone where breathing was difficult and eyes watered from the irritation. The level of smoke in the room was carefully regulated by opening and closing doors or adjusting special vents in the roof that could be covered or uncovered. An experienced housewife knew exactly how to adjust the draft so that the smoke hung evenly at the right level without dropping too low where it would bother people or rising too high where it would carry heat away. In severe frosts, the smoke vents were almost completely covered with wooden shutters, deliberately increasing the smoke level for additional warmth, even though it made breathing more difficult. Eyes watered constantly and clothes were saturated with the smell of smoke that never left even when washed, but it was better than freezing to death in the night when temperatures plummeted. The smoked walls and beams had an advantage, though, because they did not rot or get infested with wood-boring bugs that would weaken the structure, which prolonged the life of the house significantly beyond what would otherwise be possible. The soot that settled gradually on the inside of the roof and beams over months and years also acted as additional insulation against heat loss. Over the years of continuous fires burning day and night, the layer of soot became thick and velvety like black fur, creating an additional layer that had thermal properties. It absorbed heat from the hearth during the day when the fire burned hotly and slowly gave it back at night when the fire died down to coals, acting as a thermal battery. This turned the entire roof structure into a giant heat accumulator that worked continuously without any human intervention. The black color of the soot-covered ceiling visually dissolved into the dim light of the fire, creating a feeling of endless space above that made the room feel larger than it actually was and less claustrophobic. The smoke also served an important hygienic function that was not understood but was observed, disinfecting the room constantly through its antimicrobial properties. In an era before antibiotics and antiseptics were invented or even imagined, constant fumigation killed bacteria and harmful insects that could spread disease. Neither lice nor fleas, which were the scourge of medieval Europe in the south where cleaner conditions did not prevail, could survive easily in such air filled with smoke and wood particles. Smoked products, like fish and meat hanging from the ceiling beams on hooks or strings, were stored for months without spoiling because the smoke acted as a preservative through dehydration and antimicrobial compounds. Thus, the heating system was simultaneously a food preservation system that extended the life of precious provisions, an elegant example of multifunctional design. However, life under a smoke blanket required the strictest discipline and caution from everyone in the household without exception. Carbon monoxide, an invisible, colorless, and odorless killer that binds to hemoglobin in the blood, could accumulate at the bottom of the room if ventilation was disrupted by closing too many openings. People knew the symptoms of poisoning well from tragic experience. Drowsiness at unusual times, severe headache and weakness were warning signs that everyone had been taught to recognize. If someone started to fall asleep at the wrong time during the day when they should be active and alert, they were immediately taken out into the fresh air by others who recognized the danger. The ability to balance between warmth provided by trapped smoke and suffocation from carbon monoxide was a vital skill that children learned early and practiced throughout their lives. Lung disease was a frequent companion of the Vikings who lived in these smoky conditions, the price they paid willingly for warm nights that kept them alive through winter. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains find traces of chronic smoke exposure in the lungs of ancient Scandinavians excavated from burial sites. They were literally saturated with carbon from the inside, living their entire lives in an atmosphere of constant smoke from birth to death. Their voices were probably hoarse and rough, not only from shouting commands at sea during voyages, but also from the air at home that irritated their throats constantly. But the alternative to smoke and its health effects was death from hypothermia within hours during the coldest winter nights, so the choice was clear. The smoke vents in the roof were called louvers and could be closed with wooden frames covered with translucent leather that let some light through. These vents provided the only natural light in the house during the day, falling in columns through the smoke into the center of the hall like divine rays. The most responsible members of the family who understood the system were entrusted with controlling these hatches carefully. During a storm with strong winds, they had to be closed so that the wind would not blow out the fire or drive rain and snow inside, but adjusted so the smoke would continue to escape slowly without building up to dangerous levels. It was a delicate adjustment of a complex system that required constant attention and good judgment based on conditions. When the Vikings realized that a regular circular fire pit could not heat a huge hall effectively because heat would rise straight up without spreading, they invented what they called the langeld, a long fire, that became the beating heart of their home and the center of all life. It was not a round fire as might seem natural when you think of a campfire, but an elongated hearth running along the central axis of the house, sometimes several meters long depending on the size of the building. This distinctive shape allowed the entire room to be heated evenly from end to end, not just the immediate area around a central fire pit where heat would concentrate. All life revolved around this fire throughout the day and night without exception. People cooked their meals over it, ate together in its warmth, slept nearby, absorbing its heat, and told legends here, while children listened with wide eyes, learning their culture's stories. The hearth was usually lined carefully with stones which acted as heat accumulators that stored thermal energy in their mass. The stones heated up during the day while the fire was burning strongly with flames reaching high, and continued to give off that stored heat late at night when the flames had died down to glowing coals that provided steady warmth. The choice of stones used was critically important for safety and effectiveness. They had to not crack or explode violently from the intense heat which could injure people nearby. River boulders worn smooth by water or special types of rock that were resistant to thermal shock from rapid temperature changes were carefully selected and placed with knowledge of their properties. These hot stones were sometimes wrapped carefully in cloth and placed in beds like ancient hot water bottles that gradually released warmth through the night, a simple but effective technology. Firewood, which was in short supply in some regions where forests were sparse or had been depleted by overuse, was not the only fuel used to feed the hungry fire that burned constantly. Peat cut from bogs was also used as fuel because it burned evenly slowly and produced intense heat when properly dried. Peat had to be harvested laboriously all summer long, cutting it into brick-sized pieces from swamps using special cutting tools and drying them in the wind for weeks until they were ready to burn. The smell of burning peat was distinctive, sweet and earthy and slightly acrid, and permeated everything around, including clothes and hair and even food cooked over it. In treeless areas near the coast where wood was almost impossible to obtain, even dried animal manure was used for fuel, which burned surprisingly hot when properly dried and formed into cakes. Controlling a long fire was an art that not everyone could master without years of practice and instruction from experienced firekeepers. It was necessary to know exactly how to stack the fuel so that it burned slowly and steadily, giving off heat gradually throughout the day and night, rather than flaring up and burning out quickly. At night, the fire was put to sleep by carefully covering the hot coals with a layer of ash that would insulate them and allow them to smolder until morning, so that they could be rekindled easily by removing the ash and adding fuel. Losing the fire completely so that it went cold was considered a bad omen and a sign of a poor housekeeper who had failed in one of her most important duties. The fire in the hearth could burn continuously for years without ever being allowed to go out completely, passing from one log to another in an endless cycle that symbolized the continuity of the family line itself. A massive iron cauldron, blackened by smoke, hung suspended over the fire on a chain that was attached to a beam in the roof high above the flames. The water in the cauldron, constantly heated by the fire below and never allowed to cool completely, worked like a water heating radiator in a modern system, humidifying the dry air that would otherwise irritate lungs and dry out skin. The steam that rose from the hot water mixed with the smoke hanging above, softening its harsh effect on people's lungs and throats and making breathing somewhat easier. Hot water was always readily available on demand for washing hands and faces, before eating, drinking tea made from herbs collected in summer, or cooking meals that required boiling. The cauldron hanging over the flames was a symbol of prosperity and abundance, and a center of attraction for all the inhabitants of the house who gathered around it. The area immediately around the hearth was naturally the most active part of the house, where people spent most of their time because the floor was always warm and dry there. Wet clothes and shoes were carefully dried here after hunting trips through the snow and work outside in cold weather that soaked everything with moisture. The distance from the fire was strictly regulated by social status and hierarchy that everyone understood without needing to discuss it. The jarl, or head of the family, sat in the place of honor closest to the warmth, where his back would never be cold. Servants and slaves huddled in the corners, far from the flames, content with only the glimmer of warmth that reached them after heating everyone else first. Fire was an instrument of social hierarchy that reinforced the structure of society every single day. For lighting beyond the glow of the hearth flames, oil lamps made of stone or ceramics were used, filled with fish oil or seal fat that burned with a smoky flame. These lamps gave off a dim, flickering light that cast dancing shadows and produced a lot of soot that added to the smoke already in the house, but they allowed people to do necessary crafts and repairs on long winter evenings when outdoor work was impossible. Light was an expensive resource that had to be carefully conserved and was used as carefully as heat, which also required fuel. Ash from the hearth was never simply thrown away as worthless waste to be discarded outside. It was a valuable chemical raw material with many uses that made it precious. It was used for tanning animal hides, to make leather washing clothes, to remove grease and stains, and even preserving certain foods through chemical processes not fully understood, but known to work. Ash also served as an excellent insulator when poured into cracks in the floor between boards or into gaps in walls. Waste-free production was the basis of the Viking economy, where nothing was discarded if it had any possible use. Everything that fire provided, including heat and light and ash, was carefully put to use without waste. The long hearth running down the center like a spine divided the house into two halves, creating an invisible boundary between the male and female parts, or between the hosts and their guests, depending on the situation. Stepping over the hearth in the wrong place or at the wrong time could be taken as an insult to the family or a violation of sacred space. Fire was considered sacred by these people, and spitting into it or throwing rubbish into it was strictly forbidden by custom and would bring bad luck. It was treated as a living deity dwelling in the center of the house and demanding respect from all who benefited from its warmth. Along the walls of the longhouse on both sides were raised platforms, wide wooden platforms, that served as the main sleeping area for the family and any guests staying with them. These platforms were deliberately raised above the level of the earthen floor where the coldest air naturally accumulated and pooled, like invisible water. Underneath them there was useful space for storing wooden chests containing valuables and household utensils that needed to be kept dry, which also created an additional insulating air layer between the cold floor and the sleeping surface. Sleeping directly on the ground would have been a sure way to contract pneumonia or rheumatism that would cripple a person and make them unable to work. Raising the sleeping surface by just half a meter, or about 20 inches, significantly changed the temperature that sleepers experienced because warm air rises and cold air sinks by natural convection. Bedding often consisted of closed wooden boxes or cabinets resembling train sleeping compartments we might recognize today. Such bedding had solid walls on three sides and even sliding doors or thick curtains made of heavy animal skins that could be drawn closed. Climbing inside one of these sleeping boxes and closing the door behind them, people found themselves in a tiny isolated space that was easy to heat because the volume was small. The volume of air inside such a box was small enough that it could easily be heated by the warmth of one's own body without any external source generating approximately 100 watts of heat continuously. Inside these cabinets, people lined the surfaces with hay for padding straw, for insulation, and a huge amount of fur and animal skins layered one upon another. Sheepskins were their dense wolf fur that was warm and durable, and bear skins if they could be obtained through hunting or trade. All this created a multi-layered insulation system that trapped heat, effectively using the same principles as modern sleeping bags. The fur of northern animals like reindeer and Arctic fox is evolutionarily designed by millions of years of natural selection to retain heat in extreme conditions using hollow hair shafts filled with air. And the Vikings took full advantage of this natural property by collecting and using these furs. People literally buried themselves in layers of fur, creating a warm cocoon around their bodies that held their body heat close. They often slept in pairs or groups of 3 to share body heat and keep each other warm through the coldest hours before dawn. Collective sleeping was the accepted norm rather than the exception that would raise eyebrows. And the modern concept of personal space and private bedrooms disappeared completely in winter when survival was paramount and took precedence over comfort or privacy. Human body heat is a powerful source of energy when concentrated approximately 100 watts per person continuously without any fuel being consumed. 10 people sleeping together in a cramped compartment worked like a kilowatt heater running all night without requiring any wood to burn. Families slept, huddled together, pressing their backs against each other for maximum contact and heat transfer. This physical closeness strengthened social bonds between family members and ensured survival through the coldest nights when a person sleeping alone might freeze. Sleeping clothes were minimal or completely non-existent, as woolen clothing worn during the day absorbed sweat and moisture from work. Sleeping in wet clothes filled with moisture was extremely dangerous, as the water would conduct heat away from the body, rapidly leading to hypothermia. So clothes were carefully dried by the fire before bed, and people wrapped themselves in dry skins for the night without other garments. Skin-to-skin contact with natural fur provided the best thermoregulation possible because fur does not absorb moisture like cloth. In the morning, they put on their warm, dry clothes, which had been hanging by the fire all night, a small daily pleasure to look forward to. Rich Vikings who could afford luxury items could have down duvets filled with eider down collected from nesting birds. Eider down is a unique material that weighs almost nothing because the structure is mostly air, but keeps you warmer than any fur due to its exceptional insulation properties and ability to trap air. Collecting down from nesting eider ducks was a dangerous and difficult task undertaken in the spring, when the birds nested on remote rocky islands, so such beds were a symbol of extremely high status. For most ordinary people, however, only straw and sheepskin were available as bedding materials. But even that basic bedding was enough to survive the night without freezing if combined with shared body heat. Wooden partitions between sleeping areas also protected against drafts blowing through the large open hall from the entrance. The walls of these sleeping areas were covered with fabric or woven carpets to close the gaps between the boards and create dead airspace for insulation. Inside such a closed box, a microclimate was created that was warm and slightly humid from breath and sweat. In the morning, when people emerged from their sleeping boxes, they felt a sharp contrast in temperature between the warm cocoon and the cooler air of the main hall that gradually hardened the body and made it more resistant to cold. The walls of Viking houses were never just stacked logs placed one on top of another without any thought to sealing gaps. Between each log was carefully placed a layer of a unique natural sealant that did not rot over time and had antiseptic properties that prevented decay, and this material was critical to the thermal performance of the building. We are talking about sphagnum, a special type of bog moss that grows in wetlands that the Vikings harvested by the ton each autumn before winter set in. When dried properly following traditional methods, this remarkable moss did not crumble into useless dust as you might expect, but remained elastic like a sponge, filling the smallest irregularities and gaps in the wood with its resilient fibers. Corking the walls with fresh moss was an annual ritual performed in the autumn on which the airtightness of the entire house depended for the coming winter. In the fall, before the first cold weather arrived with its killing frosts, all the able-bodied inhabitants of the house walked around the perimeter, carefully checking every joint between logs for gaps that had opened. If the moss had fallen out during the summer due to weathering or been pecked out by birds seeking nesting material, it was immediately replaced with new moss that had been freshly collected and dipped in tar to preserve it. The tar coating protected the moss from moisture that would cause it to compress and lose its insulating properties, and it also repelled insects that wanted to spend the winter in the warm walls feeding on organic material. It was a never-ending battle to maintain the integrity of the thermal envelope that protected everyone inside from the cold outside trying to get in. In addition to moss for sealing joints, the Vikings used a mixture called mazanka made of clay and animal manure and chopped straw all mixed together into a thick paste. This mixture was used to coat the woven interior partitions made of branches and sometimes even the exterior walls as additional protection. The clay provided solid wind protection that blocked drafts, and the hollow straw stalks inside the dried mixture acted like the air bubbles in modern foam insulation by trapping still air. The manure in the mixture gave it plasticity while wet that made it easy to work with, and remarkable strength after drying completely in the sun and wind. When prepared correctly following the traditional recipe that had been perfected over generations, the mixture became as hard as stone when fully cured and lasted for decades without crumbling or washing away. The corners of the house, which were the most vulnerable points to freezing and heat loss due to their geometry, were insulated with particular care and attention by experienced builders. They were often made double-walled with extra thickness or rounded on the inside to avoid the sharp angles where cold air could stagnate in pockets. Outside on the exterior, the corners could be covered with packed earth or an additional layer of turf that blended into the surrounding landscape. This created a smooth, gradual transition from the vertical wall to the surrounding natural terrain. The house seemed to grow organically out of the hill like a natural formation becoming part of the landscape rather than an intrusion into it. Inside the house, the walls were often hung with woven carpets made on looms or animal skins that served multiple purposes. This was not just decoration to make the home beautiful and display wealth, but an additional essential layer of insulation against cold air. Working on the principle of a modern wall hanging or tapestry, the layer of air trapped between the cold wall and the textile retained heat, effectively preventing it from conducting through the logs to the outside where it would be lost forever. The interiors of wealthy homes resembled colorful tents hung with elaborate wool tapestries depicting mythological scenes and family histories woven by skilled women. Here, beauty and artistic expression went hand in hand with practical functionality in perfect harmony. The floor at the junction where it met the wall also required special attention to prevent cold air from pulling at people's feet and legs. Long rolls of twisted straw or fabric were laid around the entire perimeter like draft snakes we might use today. These barriers blocked the cold drafts coming from the lower portions of the log house, where gaps were most likely to occur between the wall and floor. In winter, when snow piled up high outside against the walls, it provided additional insulation for the lower part of the exterior walls and was never removed. Snow was never shoveled away from the walls of the house by the inhabitants as you might do today. On the contrary, it was sometimes raked closer to create an insulating bank that kept heat from escaping through the base of the walls. Cracks in the logs, which inevitably appeared over time as the wood dried and aged and moved with temperature and humidity changes, were carefully filled with a mixture of beeswax and tree resin collected from pine. This composition remained somewhat plastic and flexible even in the cold, rather than becoming brittle, and it prevented the crack from expanding further with freeze-thaw cycles. The wood moved and played due to changes in humidity throughout the seasons, expanding when wet and contracting when dry, and the house required constant maintenance and vigilance to keep it in good condition. The Vikings treated the house as a living being that needed to be cared for and fed with attention and repairs, not as a static object that required no maintenance. An abandoned house would die and fall into complete ruin within just a couple of seasons without human care to maintain it. The use of completely natural materials made the house safe for human health. Except for the smoke, which was unavoidable given the heating system, there were no toxic emissions from synthetic materials releasing harmful chemicals, only the pleasant smell of wood and pine resin and dry herbs hanging from the rafters and the ever-present smoke. It was easy to breathe in such a house when fresh air was entering properly. The walls breathed naturally through their porous structure, regulating humidity without mechanical systems by absorbing and releasing moisture. Excess moisture from cooking and breathing and wet clothes was absorbed by the porous wood and moss filling the gaps. And when conditions inside became too dry from the fire burning, moisture was released back into the air to maintain comfortable humidity levels automatically. The Vikings knew that cold kills faster than any enemy's sword ever could in battle, and they understood from hard experience that proper clothing was as important as shelter. Their first line of defense against the deadly cold was clothing designed on the principle of layering multiple garments, which is used today by modern polar explorers and mountaineers, climbing the highest peaks because it works so well. The basis of everything they wore was wool, a unique, natural material capable of retaining heat even when soaked through with water, which was critical in a wet climate. The sheep bred by the Vikings through centuries of selective breeding had developed a special double layer of wool that served different purposes. Long, coarse outer hair protected from rain and wind by shedding water, while the soft undercoat next to the skin retained precious body heat by trapping air in its crimped fiber. Clothing production was a laborious process that took up virtually all the women's free time throughout the year when they were not doing other essential tasks. Every house had a vertical loom standing ready in a corner, and its rhythmic clatter as the shuttle moved back and forth was the constant soundtrack of winter life when women spent long hours weaving. It took many months of spinning raw wool into thread and weaving the thread into fabric to clothe a single warrior properly for a voyage or winter. The fabric was made thick and dense, almost felt like in texture through the weaving technique used so that the bitter wind could not blow through it easily and steal body heat. It was heavy to wear and restricted movement somewhat, but provided reliable protection against the elements that was worth the inconvenience. The bottom layer worn directly against the skin was usually a linen shirt, which was comfortable and did not irritate even sensitive skin. Linen has the property of absorbing sweat and moisture produced during physical work and drying relatively quickly when conditions allow, preventing the body from getting chilled by wet fabric. A woolen tunic was worn on top of the linen base layer, followed by a thick kaftan or cloak for the outermost layer exposed to wind and weather. The air trapped between the multiple layers of clothing acted as insulation exactly as it does in modern winter gear, because still air is an excellent insulator. The more layers you wore stacked on top of each other, the warmer you stayed even in extreme conditions, and the Vikings wore everything they owned when they set out on long, dangerous journeys across the sea or into the wilderness. Knitting with a single needle using a technique called nail-binding was a special art passed down through families from mother to daughter. This ancient technique, the predecessor of modern knitting that uses two needles, made it possible to create incredibly durable socks and mittens and hats that could withstand hard use. Fabric created through nail-binding did not unravel if a single thread broke as modern knitting would, because each stitch was knotted to the previous one. This was critically important on long expeditions where it was difficult or impossible to repair clothing far from home with limited tools and materials. Mittens were made thick and densely woven, often felted through wet pounding so that fingers would not lose mobility and dexterity in the bitter cold that could cause frostbite. Viking pants were wide, loose trousers that allowed freedom of movement gathered below the knee and wrapped tightly with woolen bandages all the way to the top of the shoes like puttees. This design protected the legs from snow that could get inside clothing and from wind that could freeze exposed flesh quickly without restricting movement needed in battle or physical work. The bandages also supported the veins by applying gentle compression, acting like medical compression stockings that improved blood flow and reduced swelling. Shoes were made from goat or calf leather, carefully impregnated with animal fat by rubbing it in while the leather was still warm to make them as waterproof as possible. Dry grass was stuffed inside the shoes instead of fabric insoles and changed every single day to absorb moisture from feet. Viking cloaks were not just decorative capes for show, but real portable tents made of coarse wool impregnated with lanolin, which is the natural sheep fat that makes wool water resistant. They were practically waterproof when properly treated with lanolin and could shed light rain. A warrior could wrap himself completely in his cloak and sleep directly on the snow without freezing, because the thick wool provided sufficient insulation. Cloaks were often lined with fur on the inside for extra warmth in the coldest conditions. A good, well-made cloak was considered as valuable as a well-forged sword and might be given as a gift to seal important agreements. The head always had to be kept warm because heat lost through an uncovered head can be as much as half of total body heat loss according to modern measurement. Hats were sewn from fur pelts or felted from wool, using wet felting techniques, covering the ears tightly to prevent frostbite of the extremities. Hoods were a separate important item of clothing, often attached to cloaks, often featuring a long tail that could be wrapped around the neck like a scarf for additional protection against wind. The face itself was protected by growing thick, full beards, which served as a natural mask against the biting wind that could freeze exposed skin, and beards also indicated status and masculinity in Viking culture. In addition to fire burning continuously in the hearth, the Vikings used another clever source of heat that required no fuel to maintain, and that was a mineral called soapstone or statite. This soft, easily workable mineral that could be carved with simple iron tools had a unique physical property that made it invaluable for survival, which was enormous heat capacity compared to its weight. A stone pot carved from steatite took significantly longer to heat up than a metal one made of iron or bronze when placed over flames, but it also cooled down very slowly over many hours, working essentially like a thermal battery that stored energy. Soapstone cookware was found in every home, regardless of wealth, because it was so useful and was highly valued as a practical tool. Steatite pots filled with food always stood near the hearth where they could absorb heat throughout the day. The stone allowed the food inside to simmer gently rather than boil violently, preserving maximum nutrients and flavor that would be destroyed by high heat. Even when the fire went out completely at night and the hall grew cold, the soup or stew in such a pot remained hot enough to eat until morning. This made it possible to have a quick, warm breakfast in the morning without having to immediately light a big fire and wait for it to heat water, a significant convenience. The savings in time and precious fuel wood were quite significant over the long winter when every piece of wood counted. Soapstone was used not only to make cooking dishes and bowls, but also portable braziers that could be moved to different locations. Small, stone containers, carved to hold coals, were carefully filled with glowing embers and placed strategically under benches or next to sleeping places at night where people gathered. The stone gently radiated heat for hours without reaching dangerous temperatures that could cause burns or start fires in bedding. These were essentially the prototypes of safe portable heaters that could warm specific areas. Such a brazier could even be taken along in a sleigh on a long winter journey for warmth during travel. Steati was mined in specific locations in Norway where geological deposits were found close to the surface and then exported throughout the entire Viking world from Iceland to Britain. Archaeologists regularly find fragments of this distinctive gray-green pottery thousands of kilometers from the quarries where it originated, often in Viking settlements and trading posts. This wide distribution shows how important and valued this thermal technology was to survival in the north. People were willing to carry heavy stones across the ocean on their ships, specifically for their heat retention properties that could not be replicated with other materials. For the Vikings living in the harsh northern lands, winter was not just a season that came and went with the turning of the earth, but rather a siege waged relentlessly by nature against human beings trying to survive in an inhospitable environment. Preparations for winter survival began in the spring as soon as the ground thawed enough to work. Stocking up on firewood and peat for fuel-preserving food through smoking and salting repairing houses damaged by winter storms, everything in life was subordinated to one single overriding goal, which was to survive the darkness and brutal cold that would last for many months. The story of Viking winter life is not just a story about firewood and stone walls and clever construction techniques. It is a story of incredible human resilience and ingenuity in the face of conditions that would kill most modern people within days. They turned simple natural materials like turf and wood and smoke into sophisticated tools that allowed them to not just survive but actually thrive on the very edge of the inhabited world where few others dared to settle. Their homes were true masterpieces of sustainable engineering where every single detail from the angle of the roof to the placement of sleeping platforms had a specific purpose for survival. Looking carefully at their accumulated experience and the solutions they developed over centuries, we understand today that real comfort is not only about modern gadgets and technology that we take for granted, but also about the ability to understand deeply the natural world around us and work with it rather than against it, a lesson we are slowly relearning in our age of environmental crisis.